And live this morning here on C-SPAN, just waiting for the Senate Judiciary Committee to hold its hearing on Holocaust Era Insurance Claims. They did just gavel in a few minutes ago on the main floor. You can watch that live over on C-SPAN 2. Senator Mitch McConnell on the floor speaking right now. As we wait for the senators to convene here this morning, let you know that the chair of this committee is Lindsey Graham. And about 20 years ago, a commission was established to find policyholders and administer payment. We'll hear some of those results during this hearing today.
Apologize for being late. Welcome to the Judicial Conference, so thank you all. Today's hearing is going to be Holocaust Era Insurance Claims, what to do about it. It's a difficult topic in many ways, but I'm glad we're having the hearing. And Senator Feinstein, I won't have an opening statement. I'll defer to you.
All right. Get settled here. First of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And today we're discussing Holocaust-era insurance claims. It's interesting. Before and during the Second World War, many Europeans purchased insurance policies to protect their assets and loved ones. While many of these individuals perished as victims of the Holocaust, those who survived and the heirs of those who did not have since attempted to collect the proceeds from those policies. However, beneficiaries have found it difficult to collect on these policies because the paperwork had often been left behind or destroyed during the genocide. To remedy this injustice, American insurance regulators, European insurance companies, the State of Israel, and Jewish and survivor organizations in 1998 established ICHEIC, that's ICHEIC, the International Commission on Holocaust-Era Insurance Claims. The mandate, very interesting, was twofold. First, ICHEIC would identify Holocaust victims who purchased insurance policies. And second, ICHEIC would administer the repayment of those policies using relaxed standards of proof so that claimants who lacked documentation or faced other barriers to repayment could still receive some measure of justice. ICHEIC actually facilitated the payment of over $300 million to almost 48,000 Holocaust survivors, their heirs, and the families of Holocaust victims. ICHEIC paid an additional $169 million toward humanitarian programs benefiting Holocaust survivors. All of this was done at no cost to the claimants to maximize the amount of compensation that went to survivors and heirs of victims. The ICHEIC process, here's the rub, ended in 2007. Since then, some European insurers have continued to pay claims voluntarily, and the New York State Insurance Department has helped process the claims of individuals who missed ICHEIC deadline. The State Department, under President Clinton, Mr. Chairman, Bush, and Obama, argued in court that ICHEIC was the exclusive process for resolving Holocaust-era insurance claims. Several Jewish and survivor groups, including the Anti-Defamation League, the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, and B'nai B'rith International also supported ICHEIC and the ongoing New York State process as the best way to resolve those claims. The question before us today is whether the ICHEIC process and the ability to submit newly discovered claims to the New York State Department of Financial Services works. Some of the witnesses on our panel argue that new legislation is necessary. So I very much thank you for calling this hearing. I think it's a very interesting issue, and be interesting to see what happens. So thank you.
I'm glad I deferred to you. That made perfect sense. Thank you very much. Senator Scott, welcome to the committee and look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this important hearing today. I'd like to welcome David Mermelstein, the president of the Holocaust Survivors of Miami-Dade County in Florida. David was born in Czechoslovakia in 1928 and was sent to Auschwitz in 1944 until the American liberation of the camp. David, I'm grateful you could join us here today to testify on this important topic so we can make sure our Holocaust survivors, like yourself, receive the help you need and absolutely deserve. Thank you also to the entire panel of witnesses who will appear today and for all those who are working to make sure we honor the memory of the millions of Holocaust victims, that we do everything in our power to support the survivors and their families. The Holocaust is more than a history lesson. It is a stark reminder that evil and hate exist in this world. As governor of Florida, I took a stand against discrimination and prohibited state agencies and local governments from contracting with companies boycotting Israel, because supporting Israel should never be a partisan issue. And as a U.S. Senator, I will continue to support Israel and take action against those who wish to do them harm. Our memory of all of those who have suffered must never weaken. Every generation must heed the call to action in the face of evil. This is the Holocaust's enduring lesson to mankind. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott, you've come to me several times about the importance of the hearing, and I'm glad we're able to get it scheduled, and I appreciate your passion. If the panel would come forward, please. Sure. Yeah, whatever works for y'all is good for me. Great. So thank you all for coming, and we have on our panel today Mr. Baird Weibel, Congressional Research. Did I get that right? Weibel, okay. Congressional Research Service. Mr. David how you say your name, sir? Last name? Mermelstein. Okay, thank you. President of the Holocaust Survivors of Miami-Dade County, Florida. Ms. Anna Rubin, Director, New York State Department of Financial Services. Mr. Sam Dubin, Counsel to Holocaust Survivors Foundation, USA. And Mr. Stuart Eisenstadt, former U.S. Ambassador and Special Advisor on Holocaust issues at the U.S. State Department. And we'll start with Mr. Weibel.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, thank you for having me here today to testify before the committee. My name is Baird Weibel. I'm a specialist in financial services at the Congressional Research Service. And just for members of the audience who might not be familiar with CRS, we are a division of the Library of Congress. Our role is to provide objective, nonpartisan research and analysis to Congress, and CRS takes no position on the desirability of any specific policy nor advocate for a policy outcome. I have provided some written testimony with increased detail about the issues that we're talking about today, and I'd also like to recognize my co-author Paul Belkin from CRS, who contributed greatly to that written testimony. My specialty at CRS is insurance, and so I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the pre-World War II insurance markets and then get into the efforts to provide compensation after the fact, and finish in talking a little bit about the policy valuations that are at significant issue today. So pre-World War II in Central and Eastern Europe, insurance at that time was not only designed to compensate in the event of a death of a loved one, but had significant asset allocation or asset accumulation properties. Policies typically ran for 20 years. At the end of the policy, if the person were still alive, they would receive the value at that time. They could have surrender value beforehand. So these were very significant assets for the Jewish population and for other populations in the area. And there was a specific policy by the Nazi government to attempt to expropriate these and other assets through the pre-war and World War time. Post-World War II, there were efforts, particularly in West Germany at the time, to provide compensation and restitution for people who had suffered and for people who had had these assets taken from them. These efforts, though, for many people fell short of what was expected, and this is especially the case in the eastern part of Europe that was under Soviet domination, where companies had been nationalized. In some cases, private insurers, in most cases, didn't exist following the communist takeover. And so it's generally recognized that for that part of Europe, there was little to no compensation. In the 1990s, these issues came to the fore again, both in insurance and in areas like slave labor, Swiss bank accounts. There were a variety of international efforts to address this, with ICHEIC being the mode that was chosen in the insurance realm. Now, ICHEIC was very much an individualized claims-driven process. They attempted to identify potential claimants, to seek out claims, to adjudicate the claims with a reduced standard, and to get resources to pay off of those claims were provided primarily from various European insurance companies. A contrasting approach, which has been a significant source of the criticism that has come of ICHEIC, could be seen as sort of more of a macro top-down approach to consider how much insurance and insurance assets might have been outstanding in Central and Eastern Europe at the time, and to judge whether or not the ICHEIC process has done a good job in paying off some value of this. As Senator Feinstein mentioned, about $300 million was paid in claims by ICHEIC, another $169 million in other compensation. These, of course, are values from the early part of the 2000s. If you adjust that to the present day, you get up a little bit higher depending on what rates you used. Estimates for the present value of unpaid Holocaust era insurance claims in Central and Eastern Europe range from approximately $2 billion to about $25 billion in current day values. As an economist, I would say that there are a variety of economic tools that you can use to parse these numbers. But significantly, as you drill down to how the numbers are developed, you very quickly come to very normative judgments about what the proper indices to use, what counts as a paid or an unpaid claim, and the like. So I can go into greater detail in terms of how some of these numbers are developed if members of the committee are interested. But I think what I would probably leave on is simply that there is significant judgment and significant normative judgment in how you do this, that the economic tools really only get you so far in determining what the right answer is. And so with that, I will finish my testimony, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Mr. Mermelstein.
My name is David Mermelstein. I was born in Kiev, Czechoslovakia in 1928. My father, Martin Mermelstein, was self-employed business, selling beer, wine, liquor, and cigarettes. The business was part of our house. In 1944, we were all deported to the Bergsass ghetto and then to Auschwitz, crammed into cattle cars with no windows, and they put in 2 buckets, one for a bathroom and one for drinking. My parents, my 4 brothers, my sister, grandfather were all murdered in Auschwitz, and I'm the only member of my family to survive. Because my time is limited here, I give you my deposition about the Hungarian gold train, the case, to tell you how I survived. But believe me, I was lucky. Now let's talk about the insurance. I remember there was a plaque on our house that said there was insurance by Generali. Of course, we have no documents for obvious reason. When we came home, there was nothing left in the house. In '98, we worked out Florida Insurance Commission Bill Nelson for a state law to make the companies publish all the names and allow survivors to go to court if they wouldn't settle. That is when the companies came up with the idea of ICHEIC commission because pressure from the states. Everyone told us ICHEIC was not binding unless you agree to a settlement. So with all those promises, I applied. They say they could not find my father's name. They sent me a check for $1,000 as humanitarian payment. Survivors resented the idea of humanitarian payments instead of the actual fund we know our parents set aside in case of trouble. Survivors are also in shock that the U.S. government took away our right to go to an American court. Remember, those are contracts, not charity. How would those state and Justice Department people and those judges feel if they would lose everything and then their own government said they could not even go to an American court? And then their own government said they couldn't even go to court. Like every other American citizen, they wouldn't stand for it, and we won't either. I'm here to ask you to change that. Sadly, you might hear from some Jewish groups that are against Congress passing the law, but they are not, I repeat, they are not Holocaust survivor groups and do not represent survivors in any way. I have more bad news. Half of the Holocaust survivors live in poverty and cannot afford basic necessities of life. Even though Germany gives more money every year, it is still not nearly enough. It does not matter that our insurance rights were taken away. Most survivors are poor and suffering anyway. Besides, we have in writing from the German ambassador that they would never threaten to withhold funds for survivors, needs because of loss for insurance. But thousands of survivors suffered and died in misery over these past 15 years, and it was so unnecessary. $25 billion is what the companies owe. We believe all politics should be honored and full value, and the rest should be used to help survivors in need. Without action by Congress, the insurance companies will be the heirs of the victims of the Holocaust. This is unacceptable. I am 90 years old, about to turn 91. For the past 30 years, I have visited hundreds of classrooms, not only in Florida, speaking to students and adults about my experience. I do this not because I enjoy telling the stories about they are mostly very sad. I do this because I believe that all people have an obligation to become educated about the Holocaust, to remember and to make a personal commitment that they will do everything they can to never let such atrocities happen again, not to the Jewish people and not to anyone else. And I'm ending with, I will be more than willing to stay after this hearing and talk to anybody that would like to ask or talk about all these stories that I told you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Dubin.
My name is Sam Dubbin, counsel to the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA. On behalf of the survivor community, we thank you and for holding the hearing, for the members for coming here. This morning, I am saddened to report that Alex Moskovic, one of the group's founding members, passed away over the weekend. Alex was a remarkable man, a survivor of Buchenwald, who rebuilt his life to earn 10 Emmys as a producer of the ABC Wide World of Sports, and in his retirement spent countless hours educating school children and advocating for Holocaust survivors. Legislation is necessary to restore survivors' rights to pursue claims in U.S. courts against global insurers who failed to honor policies they sold to Holocaust victims. The Supreme Court in Garamendi and the Second Circuit in Generali held that survivors' rights were preempted based upon an executive branch, quote, policy that Holocaust survivors, alone among all Americans, should be limited in their ability to recover unpaid insurance policies, limited to the ICHEIC Commission. The basis of the policy was State Department press releases and congressional testimony, no treaty, no act of Congress, no executive order with any preemptive effect. As the dissenters in Garamendi said, this is wrong under the Supremacy Clause. Only Congress, which was excluded from all of this, can now restore survivors' rights and correct a major historic injustice. The opponents make three major arguments. First, legal peace. They say the insurers were promised legal peace if they participated in ICHEIC. This is not true. Number one, ICHEIC itself was always understood to be voluntary unless a claimant accepted an offer of payment, and the minutes show that. Number two, the U.S. government never promised insurance companies immunity from litigation. The executive agreement with Germany, it specifically negates that argument. It states, the United States does not suggest that its policy interests concerning the foundation in themselves provide an independent basis for dismissal of claims. And number three, the Clinton administration, Senator Feinstein, I would like to make sure you hear what I'm going to say, because the Clinton administration who negotiated that, when they went to court, they said expressly that the agreement does not preclude individuals from filing suit on their insurance policies in court, does not mandate that individual policyholders or beneficiaries bring their claim in ICHEIC, and the Clinton administration said that the United States has not undertaken the duty to achieve legal peace for German insurance companies against state litigation and regulations. The second major argument the opponents make is that legislation would undermine negotiations with Germany and others for assistance to survivors. No one has ever explained specifically why Generali and Allianz and others should be able to retain billions of dollars of Holocaust profits they owe to Jewish customers from contracts to induce Germany, of all countries, to provide assistance for Holocaust survivors. The logic there and the morality is completely inverted. In addition, Germany's ambassador explicitly rejected any such linkage in a letter he sent to the survivor leadership in 2008. He wrote, quote, while we continue to oppose 1746 and any similar bills, Germany has never threatened to respond by cutting benefits to poor survivors, and we have no intention to do so in the future. And whatever benefits the opponents claim to have created by destroying survivors' insurance rights, the big picture is awful. It is not disputed that half of all Holocaust survivors live in or near poverty and have never received anywhere close to the care they need for peace and dignity in their final years. After a decade of incremental home care increases, members of the Senate Select Committee on Aging made the statement that evidence before them proved, quote, that levels of home care funding by the claims conference would meet only 25% of the current needs of impoverished survivors. That was in 2014, after a decade of doubling from Germany all the time. And to make matters worse, emergency care services funding for that has not increased at all. One of the exhibits we gave you, and it's in the package I sent around, is a chart that measures what would be the need for an average survivor of 15 hours, 20 hours a week at $15, and what Germany actually provided through the claims conference. The red represents the amount of unprovided care for destitute survivors, and it's in the billions every year for the past 15 years. So the regime of giving the insurance companies immunity in order to supposedly provide all these benefits has resulted in tens of thousands of survivors suffering and dying without the care they need. Finally, let me just say that as far as the New York Claims Processing Office is concerned, this is the exact same argument that was made in 2008 when the opponents defeated legislation sponsored by Tom Lantos, the only survivor to ever serve in Congress. In the 4 years after that, the New York Claims Office settled 6 claims for $70,000, and they've never published any other information since then. The problem is, of course, that ICHEIC itself was not an appropriate mechanism because it was flawed in many, many, many ways. And I hope you ask me questions about that because I see my time is running out. But there's a lot of specifics that you need to understand. And in addition, I would submit that we provided a letter from Harry Rose, a child of 2 German survivors, who found the names on the ICHEIC list of German companies, went to the Holocaust Processing Office in New York, and the results are something that you need to see because it's not pretty. The bottom line is that Holocaust survivors should not be second-class citizens under U.S. law. The companies should not be immune from having to pay the money they owe. And whether it's $2 billion or $25 billion, which I believe is the correct number, that money belongs to the victims, the families, and if the rest can go to survivors in need, that would be a great thing for this Congress to accomplish. Oh, I'm sorry, can I add one thing? There are some Jewish groups who have opposed the legislation. I'm authorized to announce that the Anti-Defamation League and the Jewish Federations of North America have said that they are no longer going to oppose this legislation, and that major groups, including the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the 1939 Society of Los Angeles, the USC Shoah Foundation, the Zionist Organization of America, and Stephen A. Kozin, chairman of the USC Shoah Foundation, have all submitted letters. It was to Chairman Grassley last year, but they maintain support for what the survivors are trying to achieve.
Good morning, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and share. Is that better? Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and share my knowledge on the important issue of Holocaust-era insurance claims. As Director of the Holocaust Claims Processing Office, a unit of the New York State Department of Financial Services, I am pleased to be able to provide insight into our efforts to provide some measure of justice to the victims of a painful chapter in world history. For 22 years, the state of New York has been at the forefront of ensuring a just resolution of unresolved claims for assets lost due to Nazi persecution, and in June 1997 established the HCPO. Claimants pay no fee for the HCPO services, nor does the office take a percentage of the value of the assets recovered. Our goal is to advocate for claimants by helping to alleviate any cost and bureaucratic hardships they might encounter in trying to pursue claims on their own. Since its inception, the office has assisted over 2,400 individuals from 43 states, the District of Columbia, and 26 countries in making claims for insurance policies. To date, the combined total of offers extended to HCPO claimants amounts to more than $178 million, $34 million of which is compensation for insurance policies. In response to the complex nature of restitution claims, the HCPO employs a 4-step method to handle cases. First, the HCPO undertakes general historical research to corroborate and contextualize information specifically regarding the insurance industry in pre-war Europe, the results of which have shown that Germany, with the largest pre-war insurance market in continental Europe, also had the most comprehensive post-war compensation programs. In contrast, Poland, the country with the largest number of victims of Nazi persecution, played a relatively minor role in the industry. Realistic expectations of what policy-specific information can be found in both archives and company records must take this backdrop into account. Since 1998, hundreds of thousands of potential policyholder names from both company records and public archives have been published online. The office uses this information in conjunction with research in domestic and international public and private archives to obtain documentary evidence. This is proving critical to resolving claims. Second, the HCPO determines where to file a claim, meaning what present-day company or process is responsible for the policy in question. For claims for policies issued by companies still in existence, finding the appropriate successor is relatively straightforward. But for others, determining the successor is more complex. Indeed, in many cases, there is no present-day successor. Third, relying on relaxed standards of proof, claims are submitted to all available venues. Under these commonly accepted evidentiary standards, which are not as stringent as those generally imposed by courts, a claim cannot be rejected on the grounds that the claimant lacks complete documentary evidence. With the implementation of international agreements, the HCPO transferred thousands of claims to a variety of processes. In March 2007, with the closing of ICHEIC, its member companies, as well as members of the German Insurance Association, reiterated their commitment to continue to review and process claims under ICHEIC's relaxed standards of proof. In addition, companies generally continue to apply ICHEIC valuation standards, although they are no longer obligated to do so since the closing of ICHEIC. The HCPO continues to deal directly with insurance companies to successfully resolve outstanding claims. The fourth and final step in the HCPO process involves evaluating decisions to ensure that they adhere to agreed-upon processing guidelines. Like the missing property we search for, no two claims are alike. Each requires conscientious, individual attention and painstaking efforts, a task greatly helped by increased archival and library cooperation and the company's continued willingness to review claims. The process of restitution can be difficult and distressing. However, the HCPO has successfully brought closure to victims and their heirs. The HCPO's non-litigious approach to claims resolution shows that it is possible to obtain compensation for assets lost during the Holocaust era through open and mutual cooperation and at no cost to claimants. In closing, permit me to suggest that as we strive to achieve our common goal to settle claims for Holocaust-era looted assets as sensitively and as swiftly as possible, it behooves us all to manage claimants' expectations and not raise an exaggerated sense of what might be accomplished through litigation. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss the HCPO. I would be happy to address any questions you may have.
Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee, thank you for holding the hearing and for your continued interest in the welfare of survivors. I'm testifying in my personal capacity today and would ask that my full statement be made part of the record. Providing justice for Holocaust survivors and families of victims of the Shoah and preserving the memory and lessons of the Holocaust for succeeding generations has been a central part of my life through 4 U.S. administrations and beyond in my voluntary negotiations for the Jewish Claims Conference. I played a central role in the creation of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum during the Carter administration. In the Clinton administration, I negotiated $8 billion of recoveries for Swiss and French bank accounts, slave and forced laborers by German and Austrian companies, restitution of Nazi-looted art through the Washington Principles on Nazi-looted art I negotiated with over 40 countries, the return of communal and real property, the payment of insurance policies, and most recently the deportation of Jews on the French railway. In my work since with the Claims Conference, we've increased monthly pensions worldwide. When I started in 2009, they were 34 million euros. This coming year, 500 million euros. We've now provided 24/7 home care coverage, which didn't exist before. We've covered a new program for child survivors. We've dramatically increased pensions. None of this is enough, but it is dramatic. My passion for Holocaust justice and memory and my experience in negotiating in 4 administrations' major international agreements leads me to say to you respectfully that any legislation similar to what was considered last year, which would provide a cause of action against European insurance companies and U.S. courts for Holocaust-era policies, would have potentially catastrophic negative effects. First, in unprecedented ways, it would undermine legally binding international executive agreements going back almost 20 years with German and Austrian governments and with their private companies. Indeed, with the German companies, there were 1,000 German companies who participated in the payment of 10 billion euros, $5 billion. These have been in place again for almost 20 years. In return for these large payments from both Germany and some $800 million from Austria, the companies were given what we called legal peace. These agreements were reached with some of the toughest, most renowned class action lawyers all over the country, who agreed to dismiss their suits in return for the payment of 10 billion Deutschmarks, $5 billion in settlements. and with Holocaust survivor groups as well. We did not remove the right to sue. We could not. What we did say, and what we have done, is that if suits are brought contrary to these agreements, the U.S. government would initiate a statement of interest saying that it had been and was and is in the national security interest of the United States to resolve claims in a non-litigation context. The U.S. Supreme Court in the Garamendi case and Judge Michael Mukasey, later Attorney General under President in the Generali case, both indicated that these were appropriate uses of presidential authority, and indeed the Generali case dealt precisely with the insurance issue. Imagine the chaos of allowing new suits under these circumstances. Second, it would complicate future Holocaust negotiations since the word of the U.S. government could not be trusted. And believe me, there are still many things that need to be done in the Holocaust area, art and many property issues as well. Imagine how the credibility of the United States would be affected when under the JUST Act that you properly passed, which requires the State Department in November to give a report card on how all the countries of the Terezin Declaration are negotiated with 46 countries. And we're judging them on whether they've met their obligations. And here we would be withdrawing from international obligations that we reached. Third, any legislation would be contrary to long-standing bipartisan policy to resolve Holocaust-related claims by non-litigation negotiated claims processes without the costs of courts and lawyers and with dramatically lower burdens of proof than any federal court would require. It would lead beneficiaries of Holocaust-era insurance policies to a cruel fate of pursuing lengthy, costly, almost certainly fruitless litigation, with claimants facing high standards of proof in federal courts and other legal defenses, instead of using the low levels of proof under the ICHEIC process. Fourth, it would undermine the work of the state insurance commissioners, who in 1998 voluntarily took the lead in creating ICHEIC along with European insurers, Jewish organizations, the State of Israel, all of whom were members, and the leadership of ICHEIC, and many of you know him. I'm sure, Senator Graham, you must have worked with Larry Eagleberger. Larry tirelessly worked as head of ICHEIC for 10 years. It was strongly supported by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State Colin Powell thereafter, and Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage in the Bush administration. I can assure you, Larry Eagleberger is as tough as anyone possible. He would not have ever permitted European insurers to pull the wool over his eyes. By the time ICHEIC closed its doors in 2007, its insurance companies had paid $306 million to 48,000 victims, using relaxed standards of proof lower than any U.S. court would demand. Please understand, half of the claims did not even have the name of the insurance company because the documents didn't exist. They were able to match over 16,000 claims that had no names of insurance companies through a very tedious process. And when they couldn't find any evidence, they ended up making humanitarian payments as well. There's no court anywhere that would accept this lower burden of proof. Their work was overseen not just by Larry Eagleberger, but by all the member organizations of ICHEIC, including esteemed individuals like the former bank governor of the State of Israel, Moshe Sandbar, a Holocaust survivor, who specifically involved himself in the evaluation of insurance policies. All the Holocaust survivor groups, the American Jewish organizations, the American insurance commissioners closely reviewed the European insurance procedures and the handling of individual claims and authored their own report on evaluation.
Mr. Ambassador, you need to wrap up.
Fine. The claims deadline was extended 6 times. Fifth and last, Congress has held 8 hearings. This is the 9th. At each time, it has decided not to go forward with legislation for many of the reasons I've mentioned. The legislation would also fly in the face of opposition from virtually every major American Jewish organization and from major Holocaust survivor organizations, the American Gathering of Jewish Survivors, the World Jewish Federation of Child Survivors, the Holocaust Restitution Committee, and many more. I do have suggestions of what this committee could do constructively. Require European insurers doing business here to submit periodic reports to the U.S. government on their claims processing post-ICHEIC to make sure they're abiding by their promise to continue to resolve claims with these low standards of assurance. In addition, they could look at why, if any claims were denied, those were done, and they could memorialize the 519,000 names of potential Holocaust survivors so that if any future claims can be brought, they can be brought under these lower standards. They can use Anna's group, and they can recover under procedures that no court would ever allow to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is it Mr. Whipple? Is that right? Okay, so if you look at the number, the pot of money here, for lack of a better way of saying it, all the people that paid in to the insurance system before the Nazis destroyed this system is somewhere between $2 billion and $25 billion. Is that what you were saying?
Basically what it comes down. Well, first of all, for one thing, a lot of this money was from a company perspective paid out before the war, because part of the expropriation of that the Nazis did.
So how much was taken?
What you have is estimates for the unpaid, essentially the unpaid value of the assets. Some between, I think you can legitimately say between $2 and $25 billion.
Okay, can you say that the claims process that the ambassador just talked about, when you combine New York and this international system, is recovered less than $500 million, is that right?
I would boost that because the $2 billion is probably a present day number, and that number is from 10 plus years ago. So if you adjust for the intervening time period, you probably get to around 700 to 800 million.
Okay, taking the most generous number of $2 billion, not 25, and bringing it to present value, the current system has basically recaptured less than half. Mr. Dubin, is that correct?
That's the most generous. That's the most generous interpretation of the issue.
So, Mr. Ambassador, it's not working from my point of view. If you believe there's up to $25 billion of uncompensated claims owed, and the current system has generated $700 million, then somebody needs to look at something else.
And I would add, Mr. Chairman, that when Ms. Rubin and Mr. Eisenstadt make the paternalistic argument that they don't want to disappoint survivors if they lose in court, we respectfully disagree. Those who survived Auschwitz, like David Mermelstein and the other leaders of the organization who represent thousands of survivors around the country, they should not be treated like children, and they shouldn't be lectured to about disappointment.
Mr. Eisenstadt, how do you respond to my observation that whatever process we have in place through the claims route, that the money recovered is woefully inadequate given the pot of money available?
I disagree respectfully. First of all,
what is the number?
No one knows precisely, but let me give you this figure, okay? Germany has paid 80...
Wait a minute. Do you disagree with what Mr. Webble said, 2 to 25?
No, that's the total sum. We don't know the number of Jewish people who had insurance.
No, well, we know that.
No one knows. We know the total European insurance market. And Senator, please, Germany had the largest percentage of insured people, insurance, 52% of the whole European market. Jews were less than half of 1%. Poland had 3.5 million Jews and almost no insurance. Germany has paid on its own $80 billion since the end of the war. A significant part of that was for insurance policies, not counted in these, insurance policies, bank assets, and the like. In the 50s and 60s, the Dutch, the French, and the Germans had their own insurance payments. So when you accumulate all of those, plus the ICHEIC process, plus what's happened post-ICHEIC, then you get a very substantial additional number. But the fact is, no one can give you, including CRS, and they say that, an accurate figure of what number of victims had insurance, how large those policies were. If we subject those claimants to a court procedure and vitiate 20 years of agreements, it would be catastrophic.
But there's a disconnect here between the numbers he's giving me, and I don't know what percentage of Germany was Jewish that paid into an insurance system. I don't know if there was no insurance in Poland, and go through every other nation where through Nazi occupation, people were denied not only their art, their houses, everything else. Now we're talking about insurance. But I find it hard to believe is $700 million, Mr. Dubin.
The $25 billion estimate is the estimate of Jewish policies. It's not all of Germany. And Sid Zablodoff is sitting in this room. He worked for ICHEIC. He was the economist who went into the records of the European insurance regulators.
How did he arrive at that number?
There was the Jewish population was known, and based upon actual data, they had a propensity of Jewish people to purchase insurance, and they applied that propensity. But that was unanimously accepted by the members of the ICHEIC, all the researchers, the academics, all the people Mr. Eisenstadt are saying were so.
So wait a minute, and I don't mean to go over, but the ICHEIC group evaluated the pot of money to be $25 billion.
They evaluated the pot of money to be based upon 800,000 policies worth about $600 million at the end of the war, unpaid,
right,
for Jews.
Right.
And what they never actually put a value on that. Right. What Mr. Zablodoff did was say, let's use a 30-year U.S. bond yield as a multiplier. Very conservative, and certainly not anything any insurance company would ever accept. Based upon that, in 2007, when ICHEIC finished, that $600 million unpaid in 1938 would have been worth $17 billion. Today, 2019, that's $25 billion.
Thank you.
I just have to say, we shouldn't be loose with the facts. ICHEIC never accepted a $25 billion valuation. They never accepted. They did their own report. They commissioned their own report by Mr. Pomeroy, who was the North Dakota Insurance Commissioner.
We can figure that out.
And they got nowhere near that figure.
We'll figure that out. Senator Feinstein.
Now, Mr. Dubin, it's my understanding that even though ICHEIC, the process is closed, beneficiaries can still pursue claims through the New York State Department of Financial Services. Do you know of those that have done this?
Yes, I do. I can give you one example. Harry Rose from Miami. He's a child of 2 German survivors. He went onto the ICHEIC website in 2011 and saw the name of his mother and his grandparents as having had German policies. Now, by 2011, ICHEIC was closed, so he went to the New York Claims Processing Office. The way that those names appeared on the ICHEIC website from Germany was that the German Insurance Association, Germany got special permission to do their own thing on ICHEIC. And instead of having the companies publish their own names, they allowed the German Insurance Association to filter them and publish them on the website. So the German Insurance Association is the one who knows how those names got on the website. So when he applied to the New York Processing Office, the first thing they did was they commissioned research into Germany, into his family's wealth and all that. That took 4 months. Then they went to the German Insurance Association, who claimed they had no idea where the names came from. They were the ones who put the names there in the first place. So the problem with the processing office is the same problem with ICHEIC. There's no authority, there's no subpoena power, there's no compulsion. The companies can do what they want. And Mr. Rose, whose parents and his mother confirmed while she was alive that they had insurance, yet there's no way to force the companies to come forward and come clean.
So the remedy to this is what?
Legislation allowing this, validating the state laws requiring the companies to publish the names which the Garamendi case
So there is
struck.
no requirement.
No requirement.
Names have to be public.
It's all voluntary. And by the way, the names published by ICHEIC, 25% of German names is all that was published, and less than 20% in Eastern Europe. Mr. Zablodoff testified to that too, and he's the guy who did the research into the industry. So even though there were names that were published, and even though people who found their families' names on that list were denied claims by ICHEIC, and I've got a long list of cases, Senator, that I can show you, including one of your constituents, Larry Levy. His great-grandparents were from Italy. They had a Generali policy, and although many escaped, the great-grandparents owned the business and they stayed. They were hidden in a convent, they were betrayed, they went to Auschwitz. This story is in the package I just gave you. She had a Generali policy that was in force, and yet that policy never appeared on the ICHEIC website, never. They had a researcher in the family who went and dug it out and demanded that the Generali produce information, and finally they admitted that, yes, there was a policy in the name of the great-grandmother. That wasn't even published. So all of these so-called, wonderful elements of ICHEIC, it only resulted in a payment of 3% of the money because it was conceptually ill-suited.
So what are
for the
you
project.
suggesting?
Legislation that would validate state laws requiring the publication of names, a new federal cause of action allowing survivors and heirs to bring a new federal claim in court, sort of modeled on the Iranian terrorism model where when the courts get it wrong, Congress can come in and fix it in a 10-year period of time in order for the victims, after getting access to the information, to bring those claims. And believe me, to talk about long periods of time, when this bill passes and the companies know that they're going to have to pay the attorney's fees of the other side, pay treble damages, 6% compounded interest, they're going to cooperate and they're going to settle. It's going to be a completely different world. The world today of immunity is one where the survivors just keep getting, pushed around and disrespected.
Well, I want to ask you to put the request of specifically what you're asking for in writing and send it to this committee so that we might look at it.
And it's basically the bill that you co-sponsored in 2011 with Senator Nelson and Senator Rubio, with a couple of minor changes. But I will, if I might, that draft legislation is what we're seeking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator, may I respond, Senator Feinstein?
Yep. If it's start with the chairman, fine with me.
Since the conclusion of ICHEIC, the German companies have paid 130 claims. Generali has itself paid almost 500 worth $12 million. If the committee wishes, it certainly can require the publication of all the lists. It can have hearings about why individual cases were not resolved under the relaxed standards, but for goodness sakes, don't rip up two international agreements, one with Austria
No, that'd
and one
be
with
for us
Germany.
to decide. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Yes,
I'm asking you not to do it. You have the right to do it, of course you
Yeah,
do.
we do. Thank you for
But
acknowledging
the Supreme Court has resolved it, and so
No,
has Judge
I'm
McCabe.
very familiar with the facts. Senator Ernst.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wabel, what steps were taken to ensure that the ICHEIC's decisions were fair and unbiased? Can you talk about that process and how they arrived?
I mean, I can talk about the valuation process and the steps that went into the sort of specifics of generating the economic numbers. In terms of actual claims processing, I would probably have to defer to some of the other members of the panel.
If you could talk a little bit about the process that you observed.
Sure. Basically, I mean, in terms of the overall economics, they commissioned a specific report led by insurance commissioner from North Dakota, Pomeroy, and a French insurance executive that basically walked through and made estimates for essentially all you would need to do to estimate essentially how much of the asset value of this insurance might be outstanding. That includes the percentage of the Jewish population, the amount of the insurance outstanding, the propensity for the Jewish population to purchase, current values, and so forth. And so they did not publish an official ICHEIC number for this. When you talk about this range between approximately 2 and 2.5, the ICHEIC numbers in the range that they put out, in current day numbers, was somewhere between 1.5 to 2 versus to about 4 to 4.5.
Okay.
In order to get to 25, basically what you're significantly doing is, to some degree, re-adjudicating the German compensation post-war. So you're revaluing policies that were compensated in the German scheme post-war and saying essentially those policies were not enough.
Okay, so we have the North Dakota Insurance Commissioner Pomeroy and the French that were involved in this process. Were other stakeholders involved in scrutinizing the methodology?
This was basically a report that was done by the ICHEIC Commission, a subset of the ICHEIC Commission.
Okay, thank you. And do you believe that the ICHEIC paid a fair amount to survivors and their policyholders?
I really have no
an
basis
opinion?
to make that
Okay.
judgment.
Okay. What improvements do you believe could be made to the current New York process?
I'm not familiar enough with the New York process. I would probably defer to Ms. Rubin for that.
Okay, Mr. Dubin, and thoughts, again, just going back to what you're recommending to Congress?
Sure. I mean, my recommendation is that the company should come clean, and it should be a compulsory process, because the voluntary process of ICHEIC was a disaster. It was a disaster, and I can give you a lot of other examples. I mean, for example, they claimed that they had audits. Well, all the audits did was to determine whether or not the companies did what they said they were going to do, and every single one was qualified with the following statement: our opinion is not in any way a guarantee as to the conduct of the insurer in respect of any particular insurance policy or claim thereon at any time in any particular circumstance. Mr. Eisenstadt talked about relaxed standards of proof. That did not occur. In fact, ICHEIC imposed greater burdens on survivors than the courts would. Generali was allowed to deny claims if they said that those policies were not in their system in 1936, because they said they mechanized their system in 1936. Now, but they acknowledged that the policies had been sold. Now, in a court in the state of Florida and most states where a policy is established, the burden is on the insurer to prove what happened to it. ICHEIC flipped that burden and literally put the burden on the survivors to disprove an argument that the insurance companies were making that ICHEIC allowed them to make. And Albert Lewis, who was a former superintendent of insurance for the state of New York, was one of the appellate arbitrators, and he resigned because he was told to deny claims when people could not produce documentation. And so that's the antithesis of liberal standards of proof. Therefore, our recommendation is a law that forces the companies to produce, forces them to be accountable in the U.S. legal system, and believe me, as I quoted before, it's not violating any agreements. It's just giving survivors the rights they should have had all along.
And so I understand survivors and their families will go through the New York process with the state of New York. Then would it be reasonable then for other states to also to go through other states, or your recommendation would
Not at all. I mean,
with
respectfully, what they did in New York is ineffective, because they don't have any compulsion ability. Given the best of intentions, they simply have to accept whatever the companies say. And that's a good example of what happened with Mr. Rose. I was really fascinated to see what was going to happen when he made this claim. And you've got the documents here in these books. It was delays, 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 and excuses. And at the end, the GDV that put the names on the list in the first place said, we don't know where the names came from. And so 8 months later, Mr. Rose, whose mom was alive at the time, was unable to validate to her that they were going to get compensated for that. But there weren't policies with his mother's and grandparents' names on it, and the company should, if the law passed, the companies would have to publish that information, and then we could get to the bottom of it.
So less emphasis on who's processing and more emphasis on changing the process.
Of establishing legal requirements and accountability, that will there be actual accountability.
Okay.
Again, Ms. Rubin, with all the good things she does, no one's supervising her. There's no requirement. In fact, there was a statement by the insurance commissioner in New York that this process of waiting for claims to come in and asking for for them to be paid, wasn't working. That was in the New York Jewish Week a couple of years ago.
Thank you for your input. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Dubin, the Supreme Court in that 2003 ruling that the Clinton administration's support for the commission preempted California effort to improve claims transparency. The dissent, however, emphasized that no clear declaration of pre-exemption existed. Some argue that Congress should be concerned about the Supreme Court's interpretation of preemption in that case. Do you agree?
I agree. The preemption decision was unprecedented.
Okay. Anybody else on the panel, but not necessarily all of you unless you want to add to it. Does anyone else have something to add to the issue of preemption and whether the Supreme Court got it right or wrong?
Could I just add one thing? Because we obtained, Mr. Mermelstein made a request to the Justice Department for documents relating to the insurance issue. And they provided documents, and some of them were memoranda, which also are included in this packet, about how they should respond to the Second Circuit in response to the Generali case. And one of these, these Justice Department people, they're very intelligent, and they're also very wry. And what he rightly observed at the time was, even in cases in which the United States has filed a statement of interest pursuant to a foundation agreement, there is considerable tension between the position that foreign policy requires dismissal of an action and the express recognition in the foundation agreement that the agreement itself does not provide an independent basis for dismissal. And yet they supported Generali anyway.
Okay.
Sir, you asked others in the panel?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, it was not only the Supreme Court, by majority, that said this was a proper use of executive authority. It was also in a separate case by Judge Mukasey, later Attorney General under President Bush, in the Generali case, who said exactly the same thing. Going back to 1799, the U.S. has always had executive agreements to resolve claims, and these have always been upheld as an appropriate use of presidential authority. I testified many times before Congress, like 12 times, on these very agreements. They were supported by large majorities, Al D'Amato and many others on both sides of the aisle in the House and Senate. We were applauded for negotiating these agreements when going to court would have been so indefensibly difficult. So the Supreme Court was right, Judge Mukasey was right, and going back to the beginning of this republic, presidents have the authority to negotiate these kinds of agreements.
That's not really true, and let me tell you why.
I'll listen to you, and then I'll go on to my next question.
In those days, there was sovereign immunity, and so people couldn't sue those foreign governments. And so the U.S. government then basically, collected those claims and then it made executive agreements so that people could get some compensation. In the Dames and Moore case with the Iranian hostage situation, they said, there was some congressional authority to do that, and only the emergency of getting the hostages out of Iran really justified the, assignment of claims, by the U.S. government in that case. But the Garamendi court said that what's missing here is Congress, and Congress has every right to come in and change this if it disagrees with the outcome of that decision. That's the final line of that case.
Okay. Then anyone who wants to comment on this point, data from the Commission indicates a total distribution of $300 million, 31,000 claimants out of 48,000 who received payments were offered a one-time humanitarian payment of $1,000. Should Congress be satisfied or concerned with the measures of justice, and why?
Well, I can tell you from, as Mr. Mermelstein said, in my experience with survivors, the receipt of a $1,000 check from ICHEIC, which said that this is a humanitarian payment because we think you have some kind of a story, that was an insult to Holocaust survivors. Basically, it was like calling them liars. And for the ICHEIC defenders to now include those $34,000 $1,000 checks in the gross amount of, quote, compensation that ICHEIC provided is just a misdirection. I mean, it's really a ruse because it paid 14,000 claims and it paid $34,000, $1,000 humanitarian payments. Those were not settlements on insurance policies.
It's just not true. The claimants who received these payments did not complain. There has not been any mass complaint that they were underpaid. They were pleased to be paid. In more than half the cases, Mr. Chairman, they didn't even know the names of the insurance companies. And ICHEIC, through very exhaustive research, was able to match up over 16,000 names. It's only the 1,000 payments came when there was no ability to name it, when there was no documentation.
Is it correct that the Anti-Defamation League has withdrawn their objection to this legislation?
Joel Greenberg is here, Mr. Chairman, and he's been in contact with the president, and he authorized me to say that, yes, they are not objecting to the legislation.
That's news to us because they have signed on to the letter last year, so.
I got you. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Newman, can you just walk me through what are the standards of proof that the Commission and insurance companies generally require in order to prove a claim, and what do you think about the appropriateness of those standards?
You mean in the ICHEIC process?
Right.
Well, according to the little bit of data that exists, and mostly what we have is people who were denied, we have lots of people with, like Herb Carliner was a survivor of Kristallnacht in the SS St. Louis. His father told him before he died that he had insurance with Allianz. Mr. Carliner asked for that policy after the war and was told it had already been paid out. He applied to ICHEIC. His dad's name was on the list, and about 10 of his aunts and uncles were on the list. ICHEIC told him that they had already paid his father the policy, and they could not give him information about his aunts and uncles unless he could give them the names and birth dates of his aunts and uncles. Now, he was 12 years old in the SS St. Louis. That's what ICHEIC demanded. Now, they didn't send him any documents. After ICHEIC closed, the German embassy provided Mr. Carliner with some information, including the so-called repurchase document. It was dated November 9th, 1938. That was Kristallnacht, and that was the date his father was taken to Buchenwald. That's the kind of treatment that survivors got in ICHEIC.
Sir, Mr. Rubin, do you want to say something there?
Yes, thank you, sir. I just wanted to make a clarification. While the name of my office has process in it, we do not adjudicate claims. When we say process, we act as a facilitator and an advocate for claimants. We don't actually settle the claim ourselves or make decisions on any particular case. We act as a voice for claimants. We do research for them. We try to obtain as much documentation as possible as we can for substantiating their claims. We help them with genealogy research to help them explain their family connection to an insured, for example. So I just wanted to clarify that aspect of our office. And if I may interject something about the relaxed standards of proof, companies don't require that you provide policy information. They will take a letter from 1934 that says, I remember when you bought this policy, and they will investigate within their own records for any evidence of the policy, and they will make payments on policies when they don't have specific details of the policy, just say a record that a policy was purchased, even when they don't have the date of purchase or the value of the purchase policy, they can still make a claim. And I'd be happy to submit additional information about what relaxed standards entails.
Thank you. Mr. Dean, let me come back to you about, I want to ask you about private right of action. If a private right of action were to be created, would it be better in your view to leave this to state law to determine, or should there be a single national standard in your view?
There should be a single national right of access, and the legislation that we're proposing would provide that the rule of decision would be either the state law, the forum, or a general federal common law, which is like what they're using in the Iranian terror litigation at the option of the plaintiff.
Gotcha. Okay, so you're comfortable, though, you say that the state law, I mean, those will vary, obviously, by forum. The rules of decision will vary by forum. You're okay with that?
So that the plaintiff would have the option, and if general federal common law was more favorable, they would have the right to use that. But because of the Garamendi case, there has to be a federal statute to reopen the right of access to courts.
Finally, Mr. Mermelstein, let me just ask you this. Thank you for appearing here today. Thank you for your advocacy. I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you feel that Congress and this committee need to understand about the challenges that Holocaust survivors and their descendants face in vindicating their insurance claims and receiving their due compensation.
I didn't get it.
Saying, how do you feel to have your rights stripped away from the ability to go to court?
Oh, how I feel about taking away the right?
Yeah, anything you'd like to add that you
Very
think we
bad.
should understand?
Not only me, all the people that I dealt with. And in Dade County, I deal with most of them. It hurt us then, and it still hurts us today. That my friend was a soldier in Korea, yet he came home and he couldn't go to an American court. I passed the thing, but they didn't take me because I became a father. But took away our rights to go to an American court. And let me just add one thing. The gentleman mentioned that Germany gave a big increase. So I want to tell the Senate that had something to do with that, because I came to Liana Loss-Leitonen. She worked with me since she just went to the state even, and told her that she has to do one more thing. Pass a resolution in Congress that Germany is not doing what they promised that they would do. And she said, how about the two senators that you know? You're going to talk to them? Yeah. Senator Nelson was a senator yet then, and Senator Rubio. So I talked to them. And the senator will tell you it was passed unanimous in both houses. And we got the biggest increase from Germany then than we got in all these years.
Well, thank you all. We've just been informed the Anti-Defamation League still opposes the legislation, so the information provided is not correct. We just got an email. We'll follow up on it.
Well, again, if so, then that's different than what they told Mr. Greenberg, than what the president, Mr. Greenblatt, told Mr. Greenberg.
Yeah, we'll find out about all that. I'll end on this. Tell me about the process of where the companies are not required to disclose. What's your biggest problem there? Go over that again, Mr. Dubin.
Well, they only published the names they wanted to. And so as a result, the information that was published...
It was a voluntary, here's the names.
Right. And that's,
what would you suggest we do to change that?
Validate the state laws that require those companies to publish the names of the policyholders. In other words, reverse the Garamendi decision.
Okay. And also, you said the burden has been shifted in the claims process. Explain that to me again.
Well, for example, with Generali claims, Generali argued that its database in 1936 was complete and that any claim, any policy that wasn't on that database had been paid or lapsed or something like that. And so ICHEIC accepted that as a basis for handling claims. So if you, like Mr. Gertzel is here from Maryland, his family's name wasn't on the list in 1936, but there was definitely a policy. Well, under state law, if there's proof of a policy, the burden is on the insurer to prove, lapse or payment. They didn't have to do that.
And give me an example of the case where they were saying the family had been paid, but it was on the night of Kristallnacht?
Correct. That was Herb Carliner from Miami. He's a survivor of Kristallnacht. He was on the SS St. Louis when they were sent back to Europe. His parents and sister were sent to Auschwitz and murdered. But he knew he had an Allianz policy, and Allianz acknowledged that there had been a policy when he asked after the war. Now, there was a token payment from Germany, but it had nothing to do with, the fact that he was owed money by Allianz. Exactly. So then he applied to ICHEIC when ICHEIC opened up. That was, 15 or 20 years later. ICHEIC said, your dad was paid, but they didn't provide him with any documents. Well, what could he do? He had no documents, and even though there was an ICHEIC appellate process, he had no basis to appeal because he had to take that at face value. We later got documents through the German embassy because David and Herbie and the survivors' organizations had been, making a little bit of trouble for people, and so the German embassy got the documents, and the records have it, and it's in here. There's a so-called repayment document that says that on November 9th, 1938, his dad cashed in the policy. Well, he was taken to Buchenwald that day. The odds that he was, stopped on the way to Buchenwald to cash in his Allianz policy is preposterous.
And the odds that the family kept the money are zero.
Zero, because even if that had happened, that money went straight to a blocked account, and Jews were not able to access that money.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. We'll take all this under advisement and see what we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You did a great job with that.
Yeah.